The year was 1987, and Jim Baker sat in his ornate office overlooking Heritage USA, the Christian theme park he'd built into a 2,300-acre empire. Just months earlier, millions of Americans had tuned in daily to watch him and his wife Tammy Faye spread the gospel on the PTL Club. They trusted him with their prayers, their hearts, and their hard-earned dollars. But as FBI agents prepared to knock on his door, Bakker was about to become the face of the most spectacular fall from grace in American religious history. What happened next would send shockwaves through evangelical Christianity that are still reverberating today. Because Jim Bakker's downfall wasn't an isolated incident, it was the first domino in a decades-long collapse of trust between evangelical leaders and the very people who once hung on their every word. The story begins in the golden age of televangelism, when charismatic preachers discovered they could reach millions through television screens. In the 1970s and 80s, figures like Oral Roberts, Pat Robertson, and Jerry Falwell Sr. built media empires that generated hundreds of millions of dollars. They promised their followers that faith could move mountains, heal the sick, and yes, make them wealthy. Jim Bakker embodied this promise. His PTL network, which stood for Praise the Lord or People That Love, depending on who you asked, raised over $158 million in 1986 alone. Viewers sent in their Social Security checks, their grocery money, their children's college funds, believing they were investing in God's work. Bakker sold lifetime partnerships to Heritage USA for $1,000 each, promising free annual vacations to his Christian resort. But behind the cameras, a different story was unfolding. Bakker wasn't just selling hope, he was overselling it. He sold 83 lifetime partnerships for a hotel that could only accommodate 25,000 guests per year. The math was impossible, but the money kept flowing in. Then came the confession that shattered everything. In March 1987, Bakker admitted to a sexual encounter with church secretary Jessica Hahn, followed by a $279,000 hush money payment. Almost overnight, his empire crumbled. Federal investigators discovered he had diverted millions in ministry funds for personal use, including air-conditioned doghouses and gold-plated bathroom fixtures. But if evangelical America thought the Bakker scandal was an anomaly, they were tragically mistaken. Just 1 year later, Jimmy Swaggart, the fiery Pentecostal preacher who had publicly condemned Bakker's moral failures, was caught in his own scandal. Photographs surfaced of Swaggart with a prostitute at a Louisiana motel. His tearful televised confession, "I have sinned against you, my Lord," became iconic, but the damage was done. These weren't just isolated moral failures. They revealed a systemic problem that would plague evangelical leadership for decades to come. The dangerous combination of unchecked power, vast financial resources, and minimal accountability. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into the stories that shaped our world. I'm fascinated to know where are you watching from today, and what time is it in your corner of the world? Are you a history teacher, a seminary student, or maybe someone who lived through these events? Drop a comment and let me know your perspective on this incredible story. The 1990s brought a brief respite as evangelical leaders tried to rebuild trust through accountability measures and financial transparency. Organizations like the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability emerged, requiring member ministries to maintain ethical standards. For a while, it seemed like the lessons had been learned. But the new millennium brought new challenges that would test evangelical leadership in unprecedented ways. The rise of the megachurch movement created celebrity pastors who commanded enormous influence and resources. Churches grew to tens of thousands of members, generating budgets that rivaled major corporations. Ted Haggard seemed to represent this new generation of evangelical leadership. As president of the National Association of Evangelicals and senior pastor of New Life Church in Colorado Springs, he wielded significant political influence. He had weekly conference calls with the White House and was featured on the cover of major magazines as the face of evangelical Christianity. Haggard preached that homosexuality was sinful and supported traditional marriage. But in 2006, male escort Mike Jones revealed that Haggard had been paying him for sex and using methamphetamines for 3 years. Haggard initially denied the allegations, then partially admitted to them, then resigned in disgrace. The pattern was becoming clear. The higher the pedestal, the more devastating the fall. The 2000s also brought the emergence of the prosperity gospel movement to mainstream attention. Preachers like Joel Osteen, Kenneth Copeland, and Creflo Dollar taught that faith could literally make believers wealthy. They lived in multi-million-dollar mansions, flew in private jets, and wore expensive jewelry, all while asking followers for donations. When Senator Chuck Grassley launched a congressional investigation into 6 major televangelists in 2007, the findings were staggering. These ministries had combined revenues of hundreds of millions of dollars, yet many refused to provide basic financial transparency. Kenneth Copeland's ministry owned a $20 million jet, while Benny Hinn's organization spent millions on luxury hotels and first-class travel. But perhaps no development has been more damaging to evangelical credibility than the Church's handling of sexual abuse scandals. While the Catholic Church's abuse crisis dominated headlines, evangelical churches were dealing with their own epidemic of abuse and cover-ups. The case of Jack Schaap illustrates the devastating pattern. As pastor of First Baptist Church of Hammond, Indiana, Schaap led one of America's largest congregations. He preached about biblical morality and family values to thousands each week. But in 2012, he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for having sex with a 16-year-old church member. What made the Schaap case particularly damaging was that it wasn't isolated. His predecessor, Jack Hyles, had been accused of covering up sexual abuse for decades. The church's authoritarian structure and lack of accountability had enabled predators to operate with impunity. Across the evangelical world, similar stories emerged. In 2018, the Southern Baptist Convention was rocked by revelations that hundreds of church leaders had been credibly accused of sexual abuse over 2 decades. A bombshell investigation by the Houston Chronicle and San Antonio Express News identified more than 700 victims and 380 leaders who had faced allegations. The most shocking revelation was how often these leaders simply moved to new churches after allegations surfaced, with no warning given to their new congregations. Unlike Catholic priests, Protestant ministers faced no centralized tracking system or accountability measures. But if the 1980s scandals represented moral failures and the 2000s revealed financial excess, the 2010s brought something even more corrosive: the politicization of evangelical leadership that would fragment the movement itself. The 2016 presidential election created an unprecedented crisis of credibility for evangelical leaders. Donald Trump, a thrice-married casino owner who bragged about sexual assault and rarely attended church, seemed an unlikely champion for the religious right. Yet 81% of white evangelicals voted for him, largely because their leaders told them to. Jerry Falwell Jr., son of the late Moral Majority founder, became Trump's most vocal evangelical supporter. As president of Liberty University, America's largest Christian university, Falwell wielded enormous influence. He dismissed Trump's moral failings as irrelevant compared to his policy positions on abortion and religious freedom. "We're not electing a pastor-in-chief," Falwell famously said, defending his support for Trump. But Falwell's own moral authority was about to crumble in spectacular fashion. In 2020, Reuters revealed that Falwell and his wife Becky had engaged in a years-long sexual relationship with pool attendant Giancarlo Granda, whom they had met at a Miami hotel when Granda was just 20 years old. Granda alleged that Jerry watched while he had sex with Becky, and that the relationship involved significant financial arrangements. The scandal destroyed Falwell's credibility and forced his resignation from Liberty University. But the damage went far deeper than one man's fall. Many evangelicals began questioning how their leaders could support Trump while condemning others for far lesser moral failings. Carl Lentz represented a different model of evangelical leadership. As pastor of Hillsong NYC, he attracted celebrities like Justin Bieber and built a hip, trendy brand of Christianity that appealed to millennials. Lentz carefully avoided political controversy and focused on messages of love and acceptance. But in November 2020, Lentz was fired for moral failures, including multiple extramarital affairs. His downfall revealed that even the cool evangelicals weren't immune to the same temptations that had felled their predecessors. Perhaps most damaging has been the discovery of systemic abuse and cover-ups in evangelical institutions. The case of Ravi Zacharias shocked the evangelical world. Zacharias was one of Christianity's most respected apologists, with a ministry that reached millions worldwide. After his death in 2020, multiple women came forward with allegations of sexual abuse. An independent investigation revealed that Zacharias had sexually abused massage therapists for over a decade, using his ministry's resources to exploit vulnerable women. The investigation found that ministry leaders had dismissed early allegations and failed to implement proper safeguards. The Southern Baptist Convention's own reckoning came in 2022 when an independent investigation revealed that denominational leaders had maintained a secret database of accused ministers while publicly denying its existence. The report found a pattern of intimidating abuse victims and their advocates while protecting accused ministers. These revelations have had measurable consequences. According to Gallup polling, the percentage of Americans who belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque fell below 50% for the first time in 2020. Among younger Americans, the decline is even steeper. A 2022 survey by the Public Religion Research Institute found that 29% of Americans identify as religiously unaffiliated, compared to just 16% in 2007. Many cite disappointment with religious leaders as a primary reason for leaving. The financial impact has been equally severe. Charitable giving to religious organizations has declined significantly, forcing many ministries to downsize or close entirely. The credibility crisis has made it harder for legitimate ministries to raise funds for their work. Some evangelical leaders have attempted to rebuild trust through transparency and accountability measures. Organizations like the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability have strengthened their standards, requiring member organizations to maintain board governance and financial transparency. Churches like Bethlehem Baptist in Minneapolis have implemented elder accountability structures designed to prevent pastoral abuse of power. Some denominations have created databases to track credibly accused ministers and prevent them from simply moving to new congregations. But rebuilding trust after decades of broken promises is a monumental challenge. The evangelical brand, once synonymous with moral authority in American culture, has become toxic to many Americans. Political polling shows that white evangelicals are now one of the least trusted religious groups in America. The irony is profound. The very leaders who claim to represent absolute moral truth have become symbols of hypocrisy and corruption. Their fall from grace has not only damaged their own ministries, but has driven millions of Americans away from faith entirely. Young evangelicals, in particular, have struggled to reconcile their faith with the actions of their leaders. Many have left evangelical churches for mainline Protestant denominations or abandoned organized religion altogether. Others have formed new church communities that explicitly reject the celebrity pastor model and emphasize transparency and accountability. The megachurch model itself is being questioned. Some argue that concentrating so much power and resources in individual leaders inevitably leads to corruption. Smaller, more democratically governed congregations may be less susceptible to the scandals that have plagued evangelical megastars. Financial transparency has become a litmus test for credibility. Ministries that refuse to disclose their finances or submit to independent auditing are increasingly viewed with suspicion by potential donors. The days when believers would give generously based solely on charismatic appeals may be ending. The rise of social media has also changed the accountability landscape. Church members can now easily share information about problematic leaders, making cover-ups more difficult. Survivors of abuse have platforms to tell their stories without relying on institutional gatekeepers. But perhaps the most significant change is theological. Many evangelicals are questioning the authoritarian church structures that enabled so much abuse. The concept of unquestioned pastoral authority, once central to many evangelical churches, is being replaced by more collaborative models of leadership. The scandal surrounding Mars Hill Church and its pastor Mark Driscoll illustrated this shift. Driscoll built a megachurch empire based on aggressive masculine leadership and unquestioning submission to pastoral authority. But his bullying behavior and financial irregularities eventually led to the church's collapse in 2014. What made the Mars Hill situation different was the response of ordinary church members. Instead of quietly leaving, they organized and demanded accountability. Their efforts, documented in podcasts and social media, helped expose Driscoll's abusive practices and ultimately led to his resignation. This pattern of grassroots accountability is being repeated across evangelical America. Church members are no longer willing to simply trust their leaders blindly. They demand transparency, question authority, and hold their pastors accountable to the same moral standards they preach. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated these trends. When many evangelical leaders downplayed the virus or refused to follow public health guidelines, they further damaged their credibility with members who lost family members to the disease. The political polarization around pandemic responses split many congregations along ideological lines. Some evangelical leaders have acknowledged the crisis of trust and called for genuine reform. Pastor Russell Moore, former president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, has been particularly vocal about the need for accountability and transparency. "We have a crisis of trust because we have earned a crisis of trust," Moore wrote in 2021. "We cannot simply rebrand our way out of this. We need genuine repentance and systemic change." But reform efforts face significant resistance from entrenched interests. Many evangelical institutions depend on the celebrity pastor model for fundraising and growth. Implementing genuine accountability measures could threaten their financial viability. The generational divide within evangelicalism is becoming increasingly apparent. Older evangelicals who lived through the movement's rise to political prominence may be more willing to overlook moral failures in pursuit of political goals. Younger evangelicals, by contrast, often prioritize authenticity and consistency over political influence. This divide was evident in the 2020 presidential election, when white evangelicals over 65 voted for Trump at even higher rates than in 2016, while younger evangelicals showed less enthusiasm for the former president. The question facing evangelical Christianity today is whether it can rebuild the trust it has squandered. Some argue that the movement's emphasis on absolute truth claims makes it particularly vulnerable to credibility crises. When leaders claim to speak for God, their moral failures seem especially hypocritical. Others believe that returning to core Christian principles of humility, service, and accountability could restore credibility. They point to leaders like World Vision's Richard Stearns or Sojourner's Jim Wallace as examples of evangelical leaders who have maintained credibility by focusing on social justice and avoiding political partisanship. The stakes could not be higher. Christianity remains the world's largest religion, with evangelical Protestantism representing a significant portion of that population. If evangelical leaders cannot rebuild trust with their own followers, the implications extend far beyond church walls. In American politics, the evangelical vote has been a decisive factor in multiple elections. But as younger evangelicals become disillusioned with their leaders' political choices, that influence may wane. The Republican Party's reliance on evangelical support could become a liability if the movement continues to lose credibility. Internationally, American evangelicalism has been a major force in global missions and humanitarian work. Organizations like Samaritan's Purse and World Vision have provided billions of dollars in aid to developing countries. If supporters lose trust in evangelical leadership, this vital work could suffer. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis of trust in evangelical leadership has implications for faith itself. When religious leaders fail so spectacularly, it raises questions about the validity of their message. If those who claim to be closest to God behave worse than secular leaders, what does that say about the transformative power of faith? Before we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to take a moment to thank all of you who support Professor Archive. Your engagement in the comments, your shares, and your subscriptions keep this channel going. If you found today's investigation valuable and want to support more content like this, consider leaving a super thanks. It really helps us continue bringing you these detailed historical analyses. The story of how evangelical leaders lost the trust of their people is still being written. Each new scandal, each failure of accountability, each choice to prioritize politics over principles adds another chapter to this ongoing narrative. Some evangelical leaders have learned from past mistakes and are working to rebuild credibility through transparency and genuine accountability. Others continue to operate as if nothing has changed, seeming to believe that charisma and political influence can substitute for moral authority. The outcome of this struggle will determine not just the future of evangelical Christianity, but potentially the role of religion in American public life. Will evangelical leaders find a way to restore the trust they have so thoroughly squandered? Or will their movement continue to hemorrhage members and influence, becoming a cautionary tale about the corruption that follows unchecked power? What is certain is that the days of blind faith in religious authority are over. The believers who once hung on every word of their favorite televangelist now demand answers, transparency, and accountability. They have seen too many heroes fall, too many promises broken, too many sacred trusts violated. The evangelical leaders who emerge from this crisis will be those who understand that true spiritual authority comes not from claiming to speak for God, but from humbly serving others and submitting to the same moral standards they preach. They will recognize that trust, once lost, can only be rebuilt through consistent actions over time, not through clever marketing or political maneuvering. The question remains, is evangelical Christianity capable of such fundamental change? Or will the patterns of scandal and corruption that have defined the movement for decades continue to drive believers away? The answer may determine whether one of America's most influential religious movements can survive its own success. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Professor Archive. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth historical investigations, and I'll see you in the next documentary.